All right, so I'm going to start off with a really simple, really complicated question. Do you guys know what I mean when I say a really simple, really complicated question? It's kind of an oxymoron, right? And no, an oxymoron is something that doesn't necessarily make sense together, not the guy that's preaching. I'm going to ask you a really simple, really complicated question. And here's why it's both really simple, because the answer will come quickly, and really complicated, because the answer isn't easy. So I'm going to ask you this really simple, really complicated question, and I want you to really think about it, all right? You guys ready for the really simple, really complicated question? What's the most that you're willing to risk? What's the most that you're willing to risk? Can you see now why that's a really simple question that's also really complicated? That's the question I want us to keep asking ourselves as we move forward this morning. What's the most I'm willing to risk? Even at certain points of the sermon today, where I'm going to be preaching and it's going to be so great, you're going to be like, wow, that's the best sermon I've ever heard. It's okay to pause and in the back of your mind, reflect on this question. What's the most you're willing to risk? Because I want us to mull on it. I want us to chew on this question because it's so simple that it's complicated. Because when we talk about the word risk, we kind of have to realize that we live in a culture that doesn't value risk. Actually, we live in a culture that's pretty risk averse. In fact, some of you guys know that the last couple of weeks I haven't been here. I was in Jordan for a mission trip, and the last few days of that we went to Israel. And during that time, I got to spend probably about 48 hours, maybe more than that, maybe more like probably about 3.5 full days in the airport, on airplanes, going through airport security. And you realize that we live in a society that is risk averse, right? I'll never forget, actually leaving Israel. The Israeli Defense Force, they're serious folks. You don't want to mess with them. They know what they're doing. They could destroy you if they wanted to. They're really, really well trained to keep people in Israel safe, right? And I was trying to get out of the country, right? I showed up at the airport. I get there. I was the first person in line, at 1:45 in the morning to get my luggage checked, and I'm going through security, and they wanted to make sure that I was safe to let on those airplanes. And the questions that they asked me led to some answers that made them a little bit uncomfortable with me. So we came into Israel from Jordan, and so they're going to ask the question, what were you doing in Jordan? And so, at this point, I've been trained relentlessly, hey, when you're going through, just try to keep it as simple as possible, right? But the truth was, I was in Jordan to help refugees. So I said, I was in Jordan to help refugees. And the lady was like, why would you want to do that? And so there, I'm faced with another quandary, right? What do I say? Well, I'm not going to lie to these people because they're terrifying. So I said the truth. Well, I love Jesus, and because I love Jesus, I believe that that means that God calls me to love other people, and the people that seem to be in the most need that I know about are the refugees in Jordan from Syria. So you're religious. That's what she says to me next. So you're religious. And just so you know, Israel's got a great tourist industry that's built up around religious people. So they don't hate religious people or anything like that. But when they find out that you're there doing the work of God, it makes them really, really worried about what you're going to do there. Because they live in a world where you could upset the apple cart and things could go crazy really quickly. So for them, I was a dangerous person, right? I was not safe. And so I spent a lot of extra time going through security procedures because to them, I wasn't safe. Now, eventually they realized I really was just a harmless idiot for the most part. And they let me through, obviously, and I made it back here. But for them, they wanted to make sure that I was safe before they let me through. The question, again, what's the most you're willing to risk? Keep asking it. We'll keep coming back to it. What does it mean to be safe? What's the most you're willing to risk? So a few weeks ago, the last time I preached, you might remember, I complained a little bit because we used the lectionary to figure out what passages we're going to be preaching on that week. And all of the scriptures that I got were the scriptural equivalent of a little boy walking around with a rain cloud and lightning over his head, right? I got really upset, it was this is hard to preach on. But today, I get to talk about one of the coolest people that the Bible talks about, and it's a guy named Elijah. Now, we're New Testament people. We focus on Jesus, and rightly so, because, Jesus is the Word become flesh. Jesus is God dwelling among us, and so that's what we should focus on. But Elijah is really, really cool. If you're ever just looking for an interesting person to read about, just go to 1 Kings chapter 17 and just keep reading through the end of the book, and you'll see this guy Elijah does some amazingly cool things, right? Elijah is the prophet that God uses to confront all of the prophets of Baal, right, on Mount Carmel. And so Elijah's the guy, he's one solitary guy, and he says, my God is real and yours isn't. My God can make things happen and yours can't. And so the 400 prophets of Baal are sitting there. They're trying to get fire to come down from heaven and consume their offering, but nothing's happening. Elijah's like, hey, cover my offering with water. And then he says a short little prayer and boom, right? The offering lights up. That's Elijah. That's cool, right? Elijah's cool. He's a cool guy to hear about. God does all sorts of amazing things through Elijah. Elijah's the one where he's on the run. Not the coolest thing about Elijah. He runs a lot. But because his life is constantly in danger, he's the one that runs out into the wilderness, and he's up in the mountains, and he's in this cave, and he's wanting to see God's presence, right? And God says, go to the mouth of the cave. And so Elijah goes to the mouth of the cave, and then there's a wind, a mighty wind, and there's an earthquake, and there's a fire, and God isn't in any of those things. And then it says Elijah's sitting there, and a still small voice speaks to him, and that's God, right? God speaks to Elijah in a whisper. That's really cool. Right? Elijah's got it going on. He's got so many cool stories that we can talk about Elijah. But today's story takes place before all of that. In fact, Elijah kind of bursts onto the scene out of nowhere. The very first story we get about Elijah is in 1 Kings chapter 17. He just shows up to King Ahab and says, hey, Ahab, because of all of your sin, there's going to be a drought. And then he just leaves. Right? There's going to be a drought, Ahab, and it's going to be bad. This is how Elijah shows up. It doesn't seem like the most hopeful thing in the world. And you start to wonder, how is God going to use this to show us who God is? Well, so a little bit of background information. So at the time when Elijah was alive, Israel was no longer one kingdom. It was two separate kingdoms. There was Judea in the south, kind of the weaker kingdom, and Samaria in the north, kind of the stronger kingdom. And King Ahab was the king of Samaria. He's the king of the stronger kingdom. And Ahab wanted to secure his borders. He wanted to do the safe thing. And so he reached out to the next most powerful kingdom around him, the Phoenicians. And he married a princess from that country in order to secure the alliance, and her name was Jezebel. You guys might have heard of that one. Maybe we sometimes, I feel like that name is not really well used. We're kind of like, that girl's such a Jezebel. We don't mean, oh man, she's nice. I really like that girl. She's got upstanding character. She's such a Jezebel. We kind of talk about Jezebels, right? And her reputation is deserved. Because when Ahab marries Jezebel, he does something that a king of Israel should not do. He allows Jezebel's people to start building shrines to her god, Baal. In fact, that name Jezebel, comes from the name of her god. They do not worship the same God as Israel. Now, from a modern perspective, we can look back and we can say, wow, Ahab, he's so progressive. Look at his religious tolerance, right? Letting those people come in and build those altars. But we have to understand from an ancient point of view, that was not what was going on. Ahab was not being open-minded, because the God you worship was closely tied to the God, or to your state, right? To the power of the government. And when Ahab puts his lot in behind Jezebel and the Baals, he's putting the resources of God's people behind that religion. And in fact, God's people, the prophets of Yahweh, begin to be persecuted. They begin to be ostracized. They begin to be cast out of government. In fact, later on, Elijah will say, I'm the only prophet left. I'm the only one. Because what Jezebel and Ahab are doing is destructive for God's kingdom. And so when Elijah shows up and he says there's going to be a drought, in fact, not only will it not rain, there won't even be any dew on the ground. When he comes and declares that judgment, he's declaring to Ahab, you have let God's people down. Not only in your worldly role of protecting them, like having a mighty military that can keep them safe from harm, but your other role as king of Samaria is to ensure that God's people are protected spiritually, that they're not misled to worshiping other gods. So Elijah shows up, he declares this message to Ahab, and then he leaves. And where does he head? Does he head to the safest place you can think of? No. As this drought is beginning, Elijah decides to go to the desert, to a place called Wadi Cherith, which we sometimes translate as Cherith Brook in whatever version of the Bible you're using. But he goes basically out into the desert to a wadi is like a little river, but they usually dry up during drought time. And so he would have been scooping out water from the mud in order to have water to drink during a drought. And eventually with the drought comes famine. Crops start to fail. And they run out of food. Well, Elijah's in a place where there's no food anyways. Not a safe place to go, the desert. But God provides for him. These ravens, it says, the ravens bring him food. Just imagine the wild picture that we're seeing. A man in the desert scrubbing through a puddle of mud for water as birds bring him food. That's one way to depend on God. But it's not a way that looks very normal to us. And it wouldn't have looked very normal to them either. And one day, the Spirit speaks to Elijah and says, Elijah, go to Zarephath and meet a widow there. Right? Well, of course, most of us we don't have much of an understanding of biblical geography. So we're like, oh yeah, sure, go to Zarephath. Sounds great. Where's Zarephath? Well, Zarephath is it's north of Israel, and it's a suburb of some great cities that belong to these people called the Phoenicians. Do you guys remember me talking about them earlier? This is basically Jezebel's dad's kingdom. And God tells Elijah, go to this place where the enemy are and asking a widow for food. Again, not safe, but Elijah goes anyways. And he shows up to Zarephath, and the famine is hit here too, just like it's hit everywhere else. And the thing about the people that assembled this story in the Bible would have known when you thought of Zarephath, you thought of this green area in the north of Israel. This is a place where if any place could survive the famine, it would be this area. It's green today. You go there today and it is green place. And this part of the Middle East is really low on water. In fact, this modern state of Israel's biggest problems is where do we get water from? Right? They've tried using the Sea of Galilee. They brought it down about 20 feet over the last 60 years or so. It is lower than it's ever been. The River Jordan, they've tried diverting some of it to go into different places because water is a major issue. But this one place around Zarephath is green most of the time. But by the time Elijah shows up, even Zarephath doesn't have much left. And when Elijah approaches the widow, she says, listen, buddy, all I have is a handful of meal and a little bit of oil, and I was going to use it to make a final meal for my son and I before we die. Right? This is the context of the widow's encounter with Elijah. It's not just look at how nice she is. She shared with him. It's her giving away the one thing that she was clinging to for survival. The one thing she thought might help her to get through to another day so she and her son might somehow survive. And yet she gives it away. Now, there's a real temptation with this story to think that the story is about giving, right? Like, I think it would make some of us more comfortable in this room where if I said, the point of this message is that you need to tithe more, right? Some of us would be like, well, I hate that, but okay. Right? I think that we'd be more comfortable with that than what I think the message is actually saying, which is that we need to risk more. Because that's scary. But think about the context of this story. The woman has nothing. She's terrified that she and her son are going to die, and yet this stranger shows up, and she feels some sort of prompting from God to give him everything that she has left. That is a risk. don't think we like risk. Everything we do is safe, right? Think about just most of the decisions that we make are based off of what's the safest thing to do. We even do it when we show up to church. We may not be like register it, but we're like, who's the safest person for me to sit by, right? Who's the one that'll take me the least out of my comfort zone? I'm probably going to go sit by that person, right? We're safe. We don't want to risk it. We don't want to lose anything. Yet the people in this story who are rewarded are not the ones that do the safe thing. Elijah declares this powerful truth to an authority that can kill him on the spot. Not safe. He goes into the desert during a famine and a drought. Not safe. He walks into the country of the man who wants to kill him. Not safe. The woman gives her very last morsel of bread to a man she just met when she and her son are on the verge of starvation. Not safe. In fact, you could argue that the one person who does the safe thing in this story is Ahab. Right? He tried to make his border safe with Phoenicia. He enters into an alliance with them, and he compromises his morals and his people's faith on the way to doing that. When truth is declared to him, it doesn't seem safe to have somebody speak truth to power when you're the power. So he sent people out to get Elijah, and Elijah is on the run. What Ahab does is safe. What Ahab does makes sense. But what Ahab does is wrong. What's the most you're willing to risk? What's the most you're willing to risk? Chris, will you put that picture on the screen, please? This is Esdrea. I met her 2 weeks ago. She is from a place called Aleppo. She's 10 years old. When she was 4, her home was destroyed by a bomb blast. Soldiers were fighting over the place where she lived. So a lot of the people that she loved, the people that she grew up with, died. In fact, 31,000 people died in the siege of Aleppo. It's something we see on TV, but we don't experience because we're safe. We live here, right? When we talk about the Syrian refugee crisis, it seems far away, right? That's the face of it right there. I was there visiting a school that was founded by a small little church in Jordan, about 60 people, most of them either elderly or children. And they asked themselves, as this crisis got worse and worse and thousands of refugees are pouring into their country, they said, what would Christ have us do in this situation? And the answer they kept coming up with is Christ wants us to be in the middle of this. Christ wants us to do something. But that was not a safe proposition. Because Jordan, like most countries in the Middle East, has laws against proselytizing, right? Against making new converts. And so anytime the church does anything, they have to be really careful. They have to say, what is the cost going to be if we do this? Because if it gets taken the wrong way by the government, the church will be closed. The pastor will be arrested. Families could be broken up. Houses could be destroyed if things go the wrong way. But they said, we know what the risks are, and we still feel like God is calling us to do something about this. So this tiny little church started feeding the refugees in their midst. They started offering programs that taught refugees new skills. They started this school. They started giving out mattresses and beds. And pretty soon they had helped thousands of people. And the government noticed. The government didn't say, we're going to shut you down. The government said, look at the good that these people are doing. How can we help? Now the United Nations sends boxes of food to this tiny little church. And 60 countries around the world have sent volunteers to help in this tiny little church. And that school now has 170 students from kindergarten to 5th grade, because these people were willing to ask the question, what is Christ calling us to do? But it all happened because they were willing to take a risk. So that's the sneaky thing about this question I asked earlier. What's the most you're willing to risk? Is because it's not the end of the question. That's a two-part question. The first part is, what's the most you're willing to risk? The second part is this. Is that enough? Is that enough? That's a scary question to ask. It's a scary question to answer. It's a scary question to think about. But the point of this story that we just heard from Elijah is not just that we need to take risks, but also that God provides. God provided with the ravens. God provided with this jar of never-ending meal and oil. If God met their needs, then what's to keep God from meeting our needs? But we'll never know what it means to walk in that sort of abundance. We'll never know what it means to experience that intimacy with God, that providence of God, unless we are willing to ask ourselves that question. What's the most I'm willing to risk? And is that enough? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.